Okay, so basically today's lecture is on Roderic O'Conor, who was born in County Roscommon, lived outside Castle Plunket for part of his life, and our speaker today is Jody Moylan. Now Jody is actually from Tulsk. Some of you know his brother Sean, who's our postman, and I don't know if he's here, but anyway, Jody produced a really fantastic article in the Roscommon History and Society book that was published in 2018 on Roderic O'Conor. He's carried out some really excellent research on this very well-known artist at a national or international level, but not so well known at a local level. Jody's also written an article on Roderic O'Conor for the Irish Times Diary. He's also written articles on Roderic O'Conor for the Roscommon Herald. Furthermore, he's also researched and written a book on Daniel O'Connell as well. We were talking today about Catholic Democrats. Well, O'Connell was the greatest example of that in 19th century Europe, and actually made democracy respectable. But anyway, Jody's done a hell of a lot of work over the years on both O'Connor, O'Connell, and quite a number of other topics as well. And I think in the long term, Jody wants to write a book, a much needed book, if you like, on Roderic O'Conor, his work, and his art. So without further ado, Jody Moylan from Tulsk. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kieran, for that warm welcome, and thank you all for coming here today and for your warm welcome also. It's great to be here to talk about one of Roscommon's great historical figures. But of course, there's a caveat in that though he's historical, he's very much present by virtue of his living art. Indeed, he's very much in vogue at the moment, due primarily to the fact that he received wide publicity last year for his exhibition at the National Gallery of Ireland, which was really fantastic. But he's not so well known in his own county, even to the present day, and hopefully that's something we are on the road to putting right. And anyone who's interested in O'Conor is welcome to join us and talk to us about how we can continue to do that. Roderic O'Conor has remained an enigma because of a few key factors. Namely, he lived in France for most of his life, and in that life he was a very private figure. He left behind no diaries, nor did his wife Renee Honta. The correspondence he did leave behind was minimal. He was not a selling painter either. So, bar exhibitions, his art was not out there in the world really ever, and completely disappeared from view for about 20 years, from 1935, his last exhibit as a living painter, until after his rediscovery in 1956. That auction in Paris in the mid-1950s was selling off the effects of his wife's estate, Renee Honta, and she was Roderic's spouse for 7 years before he died in 1940, and she received all his inheritance until she herself passed away in 1955. Anyone who has read up on O'Conor is probably aware of the name Henry Roland, the art dealer who purchased over 120 paintings from under the noses of Parisian art dealers that day in France in 1956. Roland was in fact a German called Heinrich Rosenbaum, a fact perhaps less well known, who had moved to London and changed his name during a particularly fraught time in Europe. So it was a German who rediscovered O'Conor. It's not important, but it's just a nice little fact. Roland, back at his own dealership in London, exhibited O'Conor 2 months after the auction in 1956, and held O'Conor exhibitions again in 1957, 1964 and 1971. As with today, each showing attracted new admirers, brought new enthusiasts to O'Conor, and his popularity has continued on an upward trajectory ever since. Today he is one of Ireland's most sought after painters and is in the top 8 the last time I looked of Ireland's most expensive painters of all time, standing toe to toe with the likes of John Lavery, Jack B. Yeats and Louis Le Brocquet. So O'Connor's full name was Roderic Anthony Mary Joseph O'Conor, and he was born on the 17th of October 1860 at Milltown House, which lies just to the south of Castle Plunket village in the Catholic parish of Tulsk. He was the second eldest in the family and the first son born to Roderic Joseph O'Conor and Eleanor Mary Nee Brown. Roderic Joseph was a JP, or a Justice of the Peace, and would become the Sheriff of Roscommon in 1863 when Roderic was just 3 years of age. Eleanor Mary hailed from Ballivor in County Meath, and with her father too owning a kind of a considerable estate there in Meath. Very quickly, when reading about O'Conor, you'll discover that he's from the great Connacht Gaelic house of O'Conor, or O'Crohor, as they were known for centuries, spanning early to late medieval Ireland, where they held the kingship of Connacht more or less from the 10th century until the end of the 14th. Roderic was thus part of one of the great Catholic lines of Irish history. Milltown House, just beyond Castle Plunket, stood at the end of a tree-lined avenue, which was guarded by a high gate with lawns, gardens, orchards and so on surrounding the house and yards, none of which is present today, sadly. In order for Roderic Sr. to pursue his legal career, the family moved to Dublin in 1865 when Roderic Jr. was just 5 years of age. It's been written that O'Conor lived something of a, quote, itinerant life on moving to Dublin, as the family changed house many times before finally settling at 88 Pembroke Road in the south of the city there. The early education of himself and his siblings was likely carried out by a governess, and when he was 12 years of age, Roderic was sent to Ampleforth in Yorkshire. Ampleforth was and still remains one of the great Catholic schools in the United Kingdom. It must be remembered, of course, that Ireland at this period in the 1870s, early 1870s, was very much part of the United Kingdom at this time. Roderic was a distinguished student, gaining excellent grades in the likes of chemistry, geology, Greek, Latin and mathematics. He does seem to have had a propensity for language and art. And when we talk about O'Conor, the adult painter, we must remember that we are talking about a man who was highly intelligent and regarded as something of an intellectual heavyweight by his peers. And you really get a grasp of this kind of budding intellect when you look at his early education in Yorkshire. He got his first real taste of tragedy while a teenager at Ampleforth, when his brother Joseph, who had been boarding alongside him, got sick and died of diphtheria, a bacterial infection, in October 1875. And Roderic was pulled out of the college for 3 months after that. And it's something we don't visit often in the reading of O'Conor thereafter. His sister died also in 1879. She was 23, I think. And so it remains really a question as to how kind of he got over those losses as a youngster. But after Joseph's death, it really was at Ampleforth in Yorkshire that O'Conor was given his first introduction to the art world. By a tutor there called William Boddy, who was himself an exhibiting painter, watercolourist of some note there in Yorkshire. So the teenage Roderic continued to gain high marks in the academic subjects, and while he was accepted into London University, some second thoughts had him kind of rejecting any conservative route forward, the legal professions perhaps that his father would have liked, and Roderic himself decided to enrol at the Metropolitan School of Art in Dublin in 1879. O'Conor spent the next 3 years between the Metropolitan and the neighbouring Royal Hibernian Academy, the RHA as it's more popularly known, and between the two he managed to win no small amount of prizes, and medals, somewhat kind of justifying, I suppose, his decision to follow his own path. We're not quite sure how this went down with his family, but we do know his mother died in 1883. The same year, O'Conor decided to hit for Antwerp, to the Académie Royale, where he was joining many Irish painters of this period on the roll call, namely people like Walter Osborne, Joseph Malachy Kavanagh, Augustus Burke, and Richard Thomas Moylan. Now, the college building housed many paintings from old masters like Rembrandt and Rubens, of which you can see there. While O'Conor was just 24 when he left Antwerp, he only spent a year there. He was already looking at art in a different way than his friends were and than his peers were. He was suddenly more kind of creative and not nearly as conservative as the painting promoted by this strict but distinguished tutor there, Charles Verlat. And because it was so early in his artistic career, it seemed to be something inherent. Something inherent in O'Conor, that creativity he had, rather than something that he adapted by kind of any influence and so on. And just as an example of the art world at this time, these kind of religious scenes here from the slide here are paintings of the imagination, really, and were very much the kind of style of serious artists before the 19th century, when these were executed in the 17th century. Whereas in O'Conor's time, the late 19th century, paintings were very much about interpreting and painting what was in front of you, what you sat down and you saw in front of you, and these really are paintings of the imagination. So O'Conor moved back to Dublin for a period in the mid-1880s and was exhibited there in 1885. And at this stage he was truly becoming an artist, and in 1885 actually, his last exhibit in Ireland as a living painter was in 1885. So he was very young, 25 years of age at that stage. In 1886 he decided to move to the capital of the art world in Paris, and he stayed there from 1886 to 1889. As you can see, recognition from the Parisian art world was central to any serious artist development. At this time, criticism flourished, with many kind of French newspapers, magazines and journals carrying lengthy reviews, and they also covered Parisian art exhibitions. So it was very much the place to be. It was the centre of culture. It was a place of newly created kind of architectural beauty, promenades, boulevards, parks and so on. And really it was a place of good taste in general in Europe at that time. And Roderic O'Conor quickly became embedded in that culture under a tutor there by the name of Carolus Duran. And that, you can see him there. Noteworthy here is the fact that while at Duran's art school, it was demanded of students that they must speak French. So O'Conor, in his mid-20s, was honing a second language, honing his skills as a painter, in a long education that really stood to him. His education lasted, really his kind of secondary education lasted for about 10 years, and that really stood to him. Duran, at this time, was noted as one of the most significant figures in the art world, and allowed students to develop their own talent in line with their own artistic vision, rather than, say, pushing kind of a certain idea on his students. And it's notable that Duran only had about 10 or 12 students at a time, and they didn't pay a fee. So he was he only took the best. So you had to be very good to get into his school. Under Duran, O'Conor made his first great public leap into the world of exhibiting art. That year was 1888. That's a significant year, I think, in O'Conor's life, because it was his first major exhibit, and he exhibited a portrait painting at the Paris Salon, which was highly prestigious, and it was here really that the best kind of trained artists in France displayed their work. That year, for example, of 18,000 paintings submitted to the Paris Salon, 15,000 were rejected, and 3,000 were accepted. So it was a great honour at that stage. 1888, he was 28 at that stage, so really maturing as an artist at a kind of a mature age. He was coming into himself. He exhibited again a year later, at this time at the Salon des Indépendants in Paris, alongside, at the time, a little-known Dutchman called Vincent van Gogh. Now there's Vincent on the left. In 1890, O'Conor and Van Gogh would both exhibit 10 paintings together at the same location, and while there's no concrete evidence, it does seem likely that maybe he did meet him, although there's no concrete evidence for that. But they did live around the corner from each other in the Montmartre area of the city, and they also frequented the same painting supply shop and something of an artist meeting place at Peter Tanguay's, a place and a man made legendary recently in the film Loving Vincent. And there you can see Vincent on the left and Tanguay on the right. That image there on the right is from the recent film Loving Vincent, and though O'Conor does not feature in the film, it's really a nice way to see what the world of art was like and to understand it. And it's a beautiful film, Loving Vincent, about the great man on the left there, and it comes highly recommended. O'Conor had been noted as being, quote, unusual among foreign artists in his early appreciation of Van Gogh, with the Dutchman having a profound influence on O'Conor's art over the next decade. Though another painter, Paul Gauguin, did exert much influence on O'Conor's life shortly after this, it must be remembered that it was Van Gogh who was the real artistic influence, and this becomes very evident when we look at both their work and the striping technique they both used, and we'll get to that very shortly. Now, the prevalent kind of art style in Europe in the 19th century had been naturalism, which was the representation of things, as close to possible as the way we see them. In 1889, O'Conor travelled 70 kilometres southeast of Paris to the artist colony at Grèze-sur-Long, where the new modern form of art, Impressionism, was being practiced, and O'Conor fell in with some of those painters, notably the Americans Edward Potthast and Robert Vonno. So we can see there on the slide, on the left is Haymaking, it's called, by Jules Bastien Lepage, the godfather of naturalism at this time, and we can see the almost kind of photographic, realistic depiction of life here, very detailed faces, both the foreground kind of and the background are very much in focus, and kind of there's very realistic light and colour. O'Conor's painting from Grèze is a good example of Impressionism, in that it's an impression of reality, with the artist having a lot more kind of license with brush strokes, light and so on. Grèze was a productive period for O'Conor, and it was from here that he sent his 10 paintings to Paris to be exhibited with Van Gogh in 1890. Though Grèze was the scene of a painful episode for O'Conor when he met, fell in love with, engaged, fell out of love from, and promptly dumped his first great love, Eva Lostadt, who was a Swedish painter. Grèze was, in the main though, a successful period for O'Conor, where he painted some fine impressionist pieces and kept moving forward in his trajectory as a great European artist. And that's the man himself there, lounging at Grèze-sur-Long, clogs included. O'Conor is noted in his life as being a kind of a very deep man, very kind of enigmatic, hard to get to know, but he looks very happy there. So it's nice to see Roderic happy. And this at Grèze-sur-Long, this all preceded what was to be the most significant period of his artistic life, as he headed west from Brittany, and to the region on the southern side of Brittany, around the villages of Rochefort and Ter, Lepoldu, and specifically Pont-Aven. So you can see them just there. We can see there that O'Conor in autumn 1891 hit basically due west from Grèze towards the Breton Peninsula, and specifically to Pont-Aven, where a new avant-garde or experimental kind of group of artists had been gathered since 1886, having its own language, culture and Celtic tradition that seemed to have frozen in time long before any artist got there. Brittany was a place ideal for painters who wanted to get away from the preoccupations of their own era, new technology, believe it or not, industrialization, and so on. Many natives left the region at this time, many natives in search of employment, as the industrial age had not touched Brittany, and likewise, as one Irish painter, Henry Jones Thaddeus, at the time put it, nobody came to Pont-Aven in those days excepting painters. O'Conor was following in a great tradition again of Irish painters, Irish artists who had spent time working and living in Brittany. People like Nathaniel Hone, Walter Osborne, Aloysius O'Kelly, all great painters in their own right, but stylistically kind of very different to O'Conor. In contrast to these Irish painters, O'Conor stayed in Brittany for a lengthy period, 13 years from 1891 to 1904, which was a good proportion of his life. Artists from all the different schools of art divided themselves in Pontavin between two different hostelries, the Hotel Voyager and the Pension Glenach, where our man stayed on his arrival. So here we have Pontavin in the late 1800s, 1890 I think that picture is from, and the Pension Glenach there on the right, the nice white building there, people sitting outside. Certainly the women of the house are there, and some painters too, it seems. If you can see, you kind of really need to look at that very closely to see that. O'Conor of Pontavin was part of a group of painters that were at the forefront of artistic experimentation. They were to become known as, quote, the Pontavin School, with the Frenchman Paul Gauguin at its centre. Others in this small and tight-knit group was a Polish painter, Władysław Slawinski, who O'Conor became great friends with. There was two Dutchmen, Jacob Meyer de Haan and Jan Verkade, with France being represented by Gauguin, Émile Bernard, Paul Serussier, Charles Filliger and Armand Séguin. Now this is a typical scene here with the female workers of the inn. Also the artists are kind of all sitting around. O'Conor is not here, but there's a seated figure there, third left, in front of the door with the beard. He's a guy from Cork, Thomas Hovenden. Much like O'Conor, he left Ireland young, and he was an immigrant from a very poor family, actually, Hovenden, and he became a successful artist in America after that. In the middle there, you'll see with the bowler hat, looking very grumpy, is the mayor of the town, and also a few very nosy women looking out the window. So the Glenach was really the setting for meals, evening get-togethers and daily chatter over coffee and, quote, unlimited cider. These artist colonies in Brittany became famous for the copious amounts of cider being consumed by painters. Though interestingly, what I discovered, I think myself actually, letters between other artists at this time revealed that our man O'Conor was a beer drinker and not a cider drinker. Not important, like my other point, but interesting nonetheless. So now any quick reading on O'Conor will inevitably have the name Paul Gauguin attached, one of the greatest French painters, controversial in nature and by all accounts mad. He was, though, an artistic genius and one of the founding fathers of modernism, i.e. Modern art. And his aim really was to move art away from the very kind of visual beauty and quality of Impressionism to something that was much more kind of cerebral and thoughtful. This at Pontavin would ultimately become known as synthetism, a form of art called synthetism. And though Gauguin was to become a great influence on O'Conor, it remains the case that they only knew each other for the guts of a year, though Gauguin's influence within the whole group was massive, and that influence had a transformative effect on European art. While a friendship did build between O'Conor and Gauguin, it does seem that it was conflicted. Gauguin invited O'Conor and their mutual friend Armand Séguin, for instance, to the Samoan Islands, which was a famed exile of Gauguin, but O'Conor said that he could never imagine travelling with such a, quote, maniac, while at the same time he did help fund Gauguin's trips by buying paintings off him. Now it does seem to be the case, by the accumulated evidence, that O'Conor felt in some ways privileged by virtue of the fact that he was the benefactor of rents of his inherited Roscommon land since his father's death in 1893, and he was very generous to many of those artists around who were operating on next to nothing. He basically shared the wealth, so he gave to many artists. It wasn't just Gauguin. And also with Gauguin, from the evidence, it seems they were both the most intelligent amongst their peers, certainly in an artistic sense. And I think this may this may have drawn them together, this kind of intelligence that they had. In any case, Pontevin was the location where O'Conor met all these great minds, took great influence from them, and changed his style dramatically from his Impressionist period at Grez, for instance. Now, this painting is an early example of that shifting of style, and we're beginning to see the striping technique that became a distinct kind of feature of his work in the 1890s. The models in these pictures actually are not simply kind of sitting obediently, but they all sat for the painters for a fee, and it was part of the local economy, however kind of minuscule that may have been. From the peasant woman sewing to the peasant woman knitting a year later, we can see O'Conor's kind of striping becoming even more dramatic here. We can see the background stripes blending into the headdress, and from here into her face and hands, creating a very unique and kind of beautiful effect. This one, Head of a Breton Boy with Cap from 1893, has been noted for its similarity in technique to that used by Van Gogh, and there is something quite similar between the green and mauve stripes on the wall behind, for instance, that wrap around the cap there and the head to that of a Van Gogh background, for example, here. In this one, for instance, Vincent, and while certainly the background, this is a self-portrait that Van Gogh did, and the background is more exaggerated in this one, there is the same kind of idea at work as there. You can see there's a kind of a striping technique at work in the background. But O'Conor's similarity to Van Gogh is much more pronounced in his landscapes from this time. So here we can see that striping technique can really be seen in all its glory in these two paintings, for instance. Yellow Landscape there on the left from O'Conor, 1892, that's an 1892 painting, and Van Gogh's Wheat Field with Cornflowers. Now, these two pieces were shown together at last year's O'Conor exhibition at the National Gallery, and they show quite similar kind of movements to the stripes of pure colour that's used in both. And so a real kind of influence can be seen from Van Gogh to O'Conor, but here, as throughout his work, you'll begin to notice that no one compared to O'Conor and his really striking use of colour. And afterwards, it's interesting to note that he's been critically acclaimed as one of Ireland's greatest ever colourists, and a great use of colour. So here we can see that kind of use of colour. Very colourful, vibrant paintings, kind of especially the ones he painted throughout the 1890s in Brittany. And if you get a chance to see any of O'Conor's work on display, they kind of instantly illuminate a room or whatever space they're in. And the Merrion Hotel in Dublin probably is the best place to see an accumulated amount of O'Conor's. I think it's like they have 7 or 8 pieces in the O'Conor room in the Patrick Guibo restaurant there. And indeed, in the Merrion Hotel, if you walk in the front door, you'll see a portrait of Renee Honta, O'Conor's wife, behind the reception. It's there for many years now. So they really hold pride of place for O'Conor in their hotel. I'd really recommend going there. It's free, and you really get to see O'Conor in the flesh, and you can't he's a good man to see in the flesh, as it were, because his paintings really stick out. So, kind of though influenced by Van Gogh and Paul Gauguin, O'Conor at Pontevin remained an eclectic personality, and with his deep appreciative knowledge of paintings, he picked and chose the best artists to follow and take influence from. Others who he admired were Pierre Bonnard, Paul Cézanne, and Georges Seurat, for instance. And I think it's important to note Seurat's influence. Seurat was a pioneer of the pointillist style, which was a method of painting with carefully placed dots of pure kind of unmixed colour, and was part of the new kind of post-impressionist movement, much like Gauguin's synthetism was. This painting here, Le Lisier du Bois, or The Edge of the Wood, is a very rare O'Conor in this style, and this painting holds the record price for Roderic O'Conor, and it sold at Sotheby's in 2005 for €1.3 million. So we can see that at this time O'Conor was not kind of following any one painter. he was taking his influence from many, working in different styles. There seems to have been a real kind of effort already to kind of find a solution, to find answers to the artistic questions of his mind. And you can almost see that that questioning and the jumping of styles, kind of using different methods. He was his own man, and he was trying to work it out as an artist. And in so doing, he was creating these great works at the same time. So he was influencing people, also younger artists notably, people like the Swiss painter Kuno Amiot, for instance. And here is two of their kind of comparative paintings, Amiot and O'Connor's on the left and Amiot on the right. Amiot was said to be something of a disciple of O'Conor, and through letters to his father back in Switzerland, Amiot kind of very much enthused about O'Conor and his influence. He adopted O'Connor's striping technique, and we can see here that influence. On the left is one of O'Connor's first still lifes with flowers there. And as you can see there from O'Connor's piece, the technique is as much a part of the picture as the flowers themselves. The technique is. So with this kind of striking background and foreground, the base underneath the flowers and so on. With Amiot's piece on the right, from some years later, kind of taking up that same technique with flowers, vase and so on. And again, kind of these spectacular portraits are as much about the technique used as the subject matter. Although the figures in their kind of strange garb and kind of solemn expressions kind of lends itself to very striking images. And this is why it's really worth seeing O'Conor in the flesh, as it were. The paintings are beautiful objects, and you can really see the texture and the way O'Conor layered his paintings and so on. That one on the left is housed in the National Gallery of Ireland, although it's not on display at the moment. We talked about O'Connor's still lifes, and we'll just put up a few more here just to get a sense of what they were like. I hope you can see that properly. Just to get a sense of what they were like, and some of them really kind of show how powerful his colour was, and his kind of unique style really comes out in these pieces that include fruit, kind of apples, pears, and so on. His colouring here, especially with kind of blue and green shadows, are purely decorative, and they don't reflect what he is seeing, so he's kind of experimenting there. And many of these seem to have been done kind of close to a window or on a windowsill with kind of natural light evident coming in from on top. So he was a great user of colour, and he was always playing with light. And this one also, and I think this is one of his most spectacular kind of still lifes. Very much, just everything about it, the light and the shadow. The bowl, the way kind of it's shadowed there with blue and red, and the fruit is very much just a part of the whole picture rather than being the central focus. O'Conor was great friends with many of his circle at Pontevin, and he did help out those less fortunate than himself, like I've said, painters like Armand Séguin and Charles Filiger, who were down on their luck on many occasions, and O'Conor would intervene with money and indeed clothes in the case of Séguin, who died a destitute alcoholic in the end. When O'Conor moved to the close-by town of Rochford-on-Terre in 1895, O'Conor would visit Filiger, for example, and O'Conor would cycle his bicycle to meet him at the village of Le Poldu. He also, on occasion, visited Séguin and Paul Seroustier in another small town, Château Neuf de Foy, and that's the two of them there. Actually, that's Séguin in the bush and Seroustier painting him at that location of Château Neuf de Foy. So there, that place, O'Conor visited those two lads there. The French painter Émile Jourdan was known to visit O'Conor at his own house, and O'Conor had a lifelong letter correspondence with Władysław Słowinski, the Polish painter. So there was clearly kind of a very special bond between these painters, and they seem to have been very much friends. Kuno Amiot, who was spoken about earlier, said in a letter to his father that O'Conor was, quote, in his behaviour very calm and makes little noise. He expresses himself clearly and succinctly, so that one always knows exactly what he is going to say. O'Conor is happy to both receive criticism and give it out also. So we get a good idea of O'Connor in the company of close friends by Amyot's description. But as they weren't all together in the one location, it does seem to have been more of a time of reflection for O'Connor, where he exhibited less but retained an output nonetheless, with some beautiful seascapes from this period, for instance. Like here, O'Connor executed about 30 of these seascapes from 1898 to 1903, kind of capturing the wild terrain around the Breton coast, the wild Atlantic there crashing on the rocks. He used beautiful reds and oranges in particular, and they're really what you kind of instantly think of when talking about his seascapes, if you become familiar with them. Also, he was the only painter in his circle in Brittany who depicted the sea and the seascape around the coast. Quite odd, given its kind of scenic nature, that region of France, but that was the case. And sometimes he just painted the sea. This painting is actually my favourite from Roderic O'Conor. The Wave, that one, that's in York, that's in York Gallery, on exhibit at the moment. His water is kind of always turbulent, rough, and angry. So with this series of paintings, his time in Brittany was coming to a close, and it was after the premature death of his friend Armand Sagan in 1903 that O'Connor finally drew the curtain on his Breton period. He had learned much in Brittany, both taking and giving influence. He remained solitary, retaining his own voice and creating his own style. And he continued to exhibit, and he had made great friends. One imagines those were kind of O'Connor's glory days, and you do imagine that he kind of looked back on them with something of nostalgia. He was 31 when he arrived there, and he left at the age of 44. But now it was back to Paris and back to where his life in France had begun. So that's him there. Now, for 29 years, from 1904 until 1933, O'Connor lived in the main in Paris, bar kind of a few intermediary sojourns in Spain and the south of France. And art in Europe, and certainly in Western Europe, was undergoing a kind of a revolutionary period of its own since the birth of Impressionism. And it's interesting to note that O'Connor rejected all the art isms with the time, like Fauvism, Expressionism, Cubism, kind of Vorticism, and so on. But we must understand also that O'Connor never wholeheartedly accepted any style, and always really remained kind of on the periphery of different art movements, adapting kind of certain aspects of some and some of others to suit his own ends. He always had an individual voice. Some have said it was to his detriment. You can't instantly kind of place a style on O'Connor, pull him out of a crowd, so to speak. But from another vantage point, you could say he was kind of the true definition of an artist, always wanting to kind of explore, always wanting to challenge, and never settling for a linear path or the constraints of kind of one style. It's really what kind of makes him so unique. In Paris, he lived at 102 Rue de Cherche-Midi in the Montparnasse area of the city, quite a dingy suburb, apparently, and O'Connor kept a spacious but gloomy apartment there, by all accounts. He had a vast library of books. His collection reached 5,000 over the years, and kind of not just penny paperbacks either. He was an avid book collector, and it was one of the great passions of his life, besides painting and art. He had great taste and judgment, according to Clive Bell, who was an art critic and a great friend of O'Connor in Paris. And Roderic was noted for advising people on great writers to read well before those writers kind of achieved any kind of fame or esteem. He was a great book hunter and would kind of find rare books for friends, spending kind of no small amount of time, effort and money in the process. So really he was hugely interested in literature as well as in art, and it's kind of further evidence of a great intellect at work. So the next piece is what I put up before. That's a self-portrait from 1903, and it's just to go along with it. There's a nice description given by Bell on O'Connor at this time. O'Connor was, said Bell, A swarthy man with a black moustache, greying when I met him, tallish and sturdy. He carried a stick, and there was nothing bohemian about his appearance. In 1904 he was 40, I suppose, 44, and had not been in the British Isles for 20 years or more, so he told me. He told me too that somewhere in London he had left a top hat. He was highly intelligent and well educated, and had read widely in French and English. At one time he seems to have known, if only a little, most of the more interesting French painters of his generation. I should say he was a solitary man by temperament. Had he not taken undisguised pleasure in lunching almost daily in that autumn of 1904 with myself. Evidently there was a degree of solitude which he could not stand. I suspect he was a tragic figure, though he kept his tragedy to himself. Obviously it's a great description of O'Conor, very physical description and so on. What's less transparent is the tragedy that Bell speaks of. O'Conor kind of remained, as I said before, in his life something of an enigma to most of his contemporaries and friends for most of his life. He never left a diary behind, nor did his wife, Renée Honta, who we'll get to in a little bit. It has been widely kind of considered that he never achieved the heights or the acclaim in the art world that he believed he deserved. But there's little evidence to suggest that this was actually the case, that he did actually feel this way. It might be true, but it is worth considering, I think, O'Conor's immediate circumstances. Ultimately, he had no family. Two of his close siblings had died when he was a teenager, and his mother died when he was 23. O'Conor went to Antwerp in the same year his mother died and remained abroad basically for the rest of his life. He had gone away possibly without his father's blessing. It does seem he was on his own really from his early 20s, and you would wonder, did he ever kind of mourn properly the tragedy of his youth? It's worth considering, I think, when we think about the deep kind of solitary figure he was known to be. And to many in Paris he was a closed book, so to speak. He didn't suffer fools gladly, and he picked and chose his friends carefully. As he grew older, many believed he was beginning to suffer from a malaise, a quite serious medical condition known as grumpy old man. But there was a particular lengthy rift with the English author Somerset Maugham, whom he often dined with in company at a restaurant called the Chat Blanc, to such an extent that Maugham depicted O'Conor in one of his novels of human bondage in a very unflattering kind of light as a failed painter called Mr. Clutton. But as you can see there, as Maugham himself said, this is a novel, not an autobiography. Though much in it is autobiographical, more is pure invention. So we kind of may assume the legend around the rift was somewhat exaggerated, though it's probably kind of a good gauge of a relationship that wasn't particularly amicable. It does seem, though, that far from failed, O'Conor was kind of something of a visionary. After a rare visit to O'Conor's studio, that our critic again comes up again, Clive Bell, said that O'Conor's paintings were, quote, sometimes oddly like what daring young men would paint 10 years later, referring here to the modern kind of art movement Fauvism, for instance. Kind of on more than one occasion it has been noted that O'Conor was doing things that future movements and greats would do long before they were doing them. And that's a whole kind of subject in itself really, but it's worth thinking about, and it's worth thinking about just how influential he was. Now here we have the Chat Blanc, a nice little image there. His circle of friends whom he met on these cafe evenings in France were mostly kind of Anglo-American, consisting really of painters, sculptors, writers and their acquaintances. O'Conor was, quote, one of the most formidable people in this circle of sometimes friends. And it's interesting to note that he once had a kind of a rather heated debate at the Chat Blanc restaurant with Virginia Woolf, the famed English writer. So O'Conor really mixed with the good and the great, and he wasn't afraid to tell it like it was either. But what is notable is that O'Conor gained the friendship of many young people in his life. Armand Séguin, Charles Filiger, two artists I'm talking about, Clive Bell, for instance. They were all kind of in their 20s while O'Connor was that bit older, 40, kind of mid-40s. So it does point to a person who gave of himself and his advice freely, and also possibly because they didn't display any kind of undue arrogance that we know O'Connor didn't like, kind of the arrogance of more experienced artists and writers in France and Parisian circles. O'Connor was very much a no-nonsense kind of guy. So he's known also to have kind of both promoted and defended the art of Van Gogh, Gauguin and Paul Cézanne with this Parisian lot that he was hanging around with at these social gatherings at a time when their work was very obscure, unknown at this stage, the early 1900s. Unknown to most and kind of deemed by many to be outrageous, the work of Gauguin and Van Gogh and so on. And O'Connor was kind of a famously gruff critic of kind of some of the more famous painters of the day, painters like James McNeill Whistler, who you can see there on the right, and John Singer Sargent, who would have been kind of more conservative, not as modern, more traditional in their artistic approach, though they were very much kind of revered and respected, and indeed are still today. And Sargent and Whistler's work gains huge sums still today. So we kind of know from all this that O'Connor both practiced and preached a modernist form of art that was in contrast to many conservative minds of whom he kept company with. He was really an artistic radical whose mind was kind of completely absorbed in the art world, kind of its past identity, its current state, and its future destination. He seems to have always been thinking about art, meddling himself on the question of how to paint, and it seems to really have taken up most of his internal world. And really, to this end, kind of it was the cause of both friction with some and great friendship with others. Friendships with the likes of Bell, as we've seen, and others like the Chilean painter Ortiz de Zarate, who was a younger painter as well, and Joseph Milner Kite, one of the very great kind of American painters who became a lifelong friend and an ally of O'Connor. Now, just a word on his lifetime exhibits, the exhibits in his lifetime. And I've mentioned many of his exhibits already, but O'Connor was widely exhibited in his lifetime, in contrast to many untruths and kind of myths that have arisen about him since his rediscovery in 1956. It's a kind of a myth that still has legs in some recent kind of articles are to go by. The art historian Roy Johnson has done some great work on this. I just think it's worth noting for new people coming to O'Connor that he was exhibited widely in his lifetime, though he wasn't a selling painter. The slide gives kind of a nice detail on this. This may by no means kind of be the final word on his exhibitions, but in these years, it's interesting to note his 1894 exhibit at the Barrack in Paris drew critical praise for his use of light and colour, as did his exhibit in Belgium in 1905. The final one there, St. Petersburg, is interesting in that the exhibit there was a bought piece purchased by an esteemed Russian collector, along with paintings by Gauguin, Cézanne and Van Gogh. So that's how highly he was held when a Russian collector would buy him along with those guys. And because O'Connor's painting was bought, it was not, nor is not, on loan. That painting called Repo is still there today in northwestern Russia in the Hermitage Museum's permanent collection. So if you're ever in Russia or St. Petersburg and you think you're a long way from home, remember there's a corner of St. Petersburg that is forever Roscommon. And and that painting there is Repo, which is rest. It's the French for rest. So we can see that O'Connor was not only widely exhibited, but widely esteemed by such collectors like the guy Ivan Morozov was his name, both on a national front, which we must say is France at this stage. He was very much kind of a French painter, and on an international level, gaining plaudits, I suppose, geographically, from Argentina, where he was exhibited in 1925, to Russia, where he's exhibited there and still today. So it's very kind of far from the painter kind of painting just for himself in a studio, closed off from the world. He may have been of that kind of deep and insular disposition when it came to his own work, but he certainly shared it with the outside and was visible to the man on the street, so to speak. Now, after selling his Roscommon lands in 1910, which he had inherited in 1893, he invested in the US stock market, which he seems to have got good advice on, for it kind of allowed him to live off the proceeds for the rest of his life. Though it must be said that towards the end of his life, his finances do seem to have been tested a little bit. During the 1910s, however, his literary and painting collection was becoming quite sizable, and as a painter, his work became much more kind of toned and thinned down. This was, of course, much in contrast to the kind of thickly applied paint and striking texture and colour that we saw in his Breton work, for instance. It does, however, show kind of a spirit that was still kind of working with his artistic form and always kind of meddling, always playing and working on his art. And this piece here, Valley Landscape near Cassis, executed while on a trip to the south of France in 1913, is less dramatic than his Breton landscapes, perhaps, and seascapes, but is kind of no less beautiful, and I think it kind of shows the kind of very kind of fine-tuning of a craftsman. I think you'll agree with that. So one of the great personal aspects of O'Connor's life at this time was meeting Renée Honta during the war years of 1914 to 18, and that's her there, second from right, with himself there on the far right, big tall man. They're there together with friends. That she was a model for some of his paintings, and they built up a friendship and ultimately a relationship, which a series of letters kind of written at the time and showed them to be very affectionate and warm-hearted towards each other. One kind of might well imagine there was a sizable age difference between them, but they shared an artistic passion, and by all accounts, she was quite a jovial, generous, and good-humoured person. Renée was said to have, quote, lit up the latter half of O'Connor's life, and they married each other in 1933 after they had moved to Niles-sur-Long in west central France in the same year. Together they went to live in Torremolinos in Spain from 1934 to 1935, with O'Connor painting some of his final landscapes there as his output kind of became increasingly sparse and rare. It's interesting to note that an offer made to the National Gallery by O'Connor and one of his friends in Dublin for some of his paintings before he died was turned down due to lack of knowledge of O'Connor and his work. He died on the 18th of March 1940 after illness had affected him for some time, and he's buried at Niles-sur-Long with only his wife and a handful of villagers in attendance, and the grave there today is emblazoned with the O'Connor crest, a nice link to his Roscommon heritage there in rural France, set in stone, literally, quite literally. So really, in conclusion, we can say that he went away alone, more or less, and died with not many people around him. But in his lifetime, he was a driven man, driven by the artistic spirit. We can say undoubtedly that it was his life, the pursuit of art, the meaning of art, the creation of art. He knew some of the greats before those greats were known, and he knew their art was going to be the next big thing. He had the independence to follow his own path, both as an individual and as an artist. Strong-spirited, who didn't mince his words, but he was a great friend too, charitable, advisory and kind. He was recognised in his own lifetime through his exhibits as a great European painter. This man from Roscommon, with great Roscommon ancestors before him and a line of descendants after him, he became forgotten about. But finally, he's made a comeback. Let's hope in his own county we'll learn to be proud of him and give him the great recognition that he so rightly and finally deserves. Thank you very much.